Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change, it's hard to keep track. Today, we're going to talk about fertility, population, migration, basically human mobility and change on this finite planet and how it's affecting everything politics, the environment, particularly politics these days. I'm not in my normal situation. I'm sure some of you out there who see this will have had really bad back pain at some point. And yesterday I did something stupid, and wow, it's so I'm kind of semi immobilized. But I'm thrilled to be with Jennifer Scuba, who is, among other things, the new president and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau, PRB.org, which is a real go-to place for data without the varnish and spin on it related to what we're doing on this planet, how many people, and where we're heading, and what our dynamics are like. She's also the author of two really important books uh, in recent years. The one that caught my attention first was 8 Billion and Counting, which came out uh, maybe 2 years ago. We'll find out more.
2022. Yeah. Just
Yeah.
yeah.
And now she's a co-author with the historian and political scientist of a new book that's a really valuable right now, because this book, Toxic Demography, is basically laying out the difference between what you hear about demographics and what the reality is. I think that's one way to summarize it. It's a really good guide looking at Europe, Asia, and the United States through recent history, and trying to disentangle and understand uh, population dynamics as they're portrayed politically, and as they are in the real world. Of course, the real world is political. So, Jennifer, congratulations on all the work you're doing and your new gig.
Thanks. Thank
Um,
you.
and I just, uh, I think it's just vital issue. Last fall, before the election, which seems like years ago, I did a session on the migration part of this, and it was already turbulent, and now, of course, much more so, as our government is rounding up people based on the way they look, and in Europe and elsewhere there are other tensions. So the first thing I guess I would ask you is, what got you into this field? You know, you're a skilled researcher. You could be applying the same skills to things other than demography, but why are you in this arena?
Well, I actually started more close to where you've probably operated, which is around the environment. And I think that when even so now I have middle schoolers, I have two middle school boys, and I think a lot about when I was their age, because that is when I became a CEO for the first time, which is when I started an environmental club in middle school, the EAPA, the Environment and Animal
Interesting.
Preservation Association. Very highly successful
That's really
club in North
cool.
Georgia. Yeah, yeah. It's that taste of power. I mean, I could just never get over it, I suppose. But I was so interested in just the planet, and what was the relationship between people and the environment, and that never went away, even as I was like growing up in the Cold War context, heading into college in the late 90s. For me, all of those things they're like little ingredients that got put into the bowl of my brain and mixed together as I learned more about migration, and went to a women's college in Atlanta and studied Japanese. And I think
Hmm.
when we were going to no doubt be talking about Japan in
Yeah.
this conversation, and again, it's like these separate things were in that mixing bowl, and then something about them for me just clicked, that they all went together, and I'm never able to separate them now myself. And that's really one of the things that, even before joining PRB formally, I was a huge fan of PRB. That's how I learned about population and why it was the foundation for everything else. So we want to know, why are some countries poor and others are rich? And why are some places embroiled in conflict and others experience long stretches of peace? And for me, the real interest is in those long underlying trends, less so the proximate causes and decisions. And that's just how I see the world, is through these long unfolding trends. And that is why I am just as interested in population issues today as when it first clicked for me that that's what I was really interested in. When I look at any headline, I could probably play some sort of game where how to, in 2 steps, linking it back to population trends. That is how I make sense of the world. And I hope that is what I can bring to this as a scholar, as somebody who's interested in policy, and now as a leader in this space, is that hopefully with this lens, even though many of us are interested in the same questions, we might get different answers if we approach it from this starting point. So it's not as if, oh, well, it's population and nothing else. It's what do you gain when you look through a population lens that you might not have otherwise? How does it, you actually ask questions you might not otherwise ask or get different answers. So I love to marry those things.
Well, it's so many of my friends in the climate arena are so focused in a hyper-focused way on the changes in the climate that they're missing that much of the impacts from climate dynamics, whether it's from global warming or just the climate we already have, are based on what's happening on the ground. It's people, it's geography. I have introduced geography to climate scientists by having conversations with a geographer studying what he calls the expanding bullseye, which is how many people and how much stuff, let's say, in a floodplain, is by far the dominant factor determining whether the next flood will damage people or things. The changes in the rainfall are important too.
Yeah.
And so getting past that kind of disciplinary wall effect, I think, is great. And that's the new book. You have again a political scientist and a historian. So you're partially doing that.
Yeah.
I wanted
spoiler alert, I'm actually the political scientist in that trio.
All
which
right.
Even people who work with me at PRB have said, which one is the political scientist? And I said, gosh, I must be good at pretending to be a demographer if my own staff say the same thing. So yeah, my training and PhDs in government and politics, but because I have just really deeply, become a fan of demography and went and got some training myself in that and even at the University of Maryland. And actually a lot of my training I got through PRB in the early days. So yeah, I'm a political demographer, I suppose you could say, which is our made up term for somebody who takes demography really seriously and marries it within political science.
Well, I think it's useful to do that because again, I think and this is in the book section I just read, many scientists just see their data as sort of sacrosanct. They put it out there, and then all this stuff happens that can shock them. And what you're trying to do, I think, in this book is, at least partially, is have people get over the shock factor, that to normalize the reality that most of this is about the politics as much as the data.
Yeah, because it's mostly, all these headlines that you're putting up here. That shock factor is what people are noticing. And those of us who've been in this space a long time will have side conversations that, maybe somebody comes to, work on your plumbing and they give you that casual, what do you do? And normally their eyes would glaze over if you gave them an answer about population. No more. No, everyone has something to say about it, really strong emotional reaction to it one way or the other. And that's just not, migration, as we know, has always been politically sensitive, but there is something different about it. And we now have this fertility part. And don't forget, we're coming off of big feelings about mortality as well with COVID. So we're right in a stew of the emotional ties that people feel towards population issues being higher than I've seen them. And yeah, that's in the book. We say, take a breath. Actually, there are different parts in history in these different contexts where it's been pretty core to policymaking, to national identity, to formation of the state, etc.
Yeah. So I'm going to have you do a quick reaction to these two moments in the timeline of public discourse over these issues. We have 1960. This is even before the Population Bomb book by Paul Ehrlich, 1960. That cover is so interesting in so many ways. And then we have Elon Musk just yesterday, oh no, 3 days ago, tweeting the doom of Western civilization must be averted. And it's basically about New Zealand losing its whiteness, which there's so much there. Um, just a quick riff on that. When I'm sure you deal with this all the time in conversations, and then we'll get into the meat of the book.
Yeah, well, and I can't help but toss it to the book some with it, because that is what you're showing here with, the 19 really 50s, 60s, and 70s. This real feeling that population growth was so exponential that we were putting humanity itself in jeopardy. There was an existential crisis that you see in all sorts of writings, fiction, it's on TV, movies, all of this, and in our policymaking. And then it is as if someone goes over and flips a light switch, and everything about it is the same, except instead of too many people, it's now too few. And so what I like about doing a historical view is that you see history repeating itself, of course. I felt I'm really happy to have gotten to do the research, the real privilege of doing the research on this book during this time, because it gave me a check. This is new in some ways. I mean, the fact that we're not thinking of population explosion in the same way as before, that is unprecedented. But if you just sub out the what, it is the same kind of emotional reaction. So yeah, we see this all along, and what you show here is that it's not just the number of people, it's about who it is. And of course, that's what we see with this Time magazine cover. We see a lot of diversity on this. And yet if we were to open it, we'd see a lot of fear around that, same as we see on the other side of the screen.
Yeah, for sure. The fear factor is a big deal. So here's a line, I think this is in maybe the introduction to the book. You talk about the distortions of demographic issues in the public debate are normal, and that's alarming, but that which is kind of what we were just talking about. But how do you and then you say the anti-toxicity project we advocate aims to reduce, or if possible, eliminate alarmism and replace it with informed public conversations about demographic change. What does that look like? I know there's a whole book, but what is that project?
And I think it does sound a bit Pollyanna to imagine that we could actually take the venom out of this and make it less toxic, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it. Sure. At the end of the day, what we're really looking for, a better world, is one that is informed by data and evidence. So that, no disagreement from myself or Michael or Jay, my co-authors, on that. We want a data and evidence-based decision making. But just because you have data and evidence-based decision making, we can't pretend as if data and evidence are value neutral. And so for us, it is about, let's just do the best we can to always acknowledge the biases behind our data, to be transparent about our methods. And this is the part that I think maybe we'll have some colleagues that are not fans of us saying this part. This is our most controversial part. I think we have an obligation to understand how it is that our research might be used. And that's, a couple of people that I've mentioned the book to who are in this field, they really disagree that they should have the obligation. But so that's one thing to overcome. So what does this project look like? We first have to get researchers, graduate students, to understand that you may give someone information like demographic information, but you don't control what they do with it afterwards. And you have an obligation to, you don't have to change, but you should at least think through how they might use it. That's the fine line, though, that's hard to navigate, which is, to what degree do we have an obligation to share information because we know it exists, and take responsibility for it afterwards, or should we not share it at all? But us having this conversation is part of that project as well.
Yeah, and this issue you're describing is across the board with researchers I know of in other fields that are consequential in terms of policy. It probably doesn't matter so much for string theory,
Yeah. Yeah. But like
But
climate change, what if the environment's getting so much better? Think about the number of people who would be disincentivized to share about that. I'm not trying to feed into, I know. And then you have
yeah,
to be careful what you say. But yeah, we do have these incentives and disincentives around information sharing.
yeah, and just understanding, and it's hard to engage because
Yeah,
the most of the platforms where the engagement is happening are pretty toxic,
that's
to
right.
use the word from your headline there. I mean, the book cover. Um, and like I think I mentioned to you before we went on air, these geographers who've done mapping of like flood vulnerability based on, they have a methodology they call expanding bullseye, where they can chart, very clearly how many people, how much more people and stuff is in harm's way from a flood or fire. And one day I was at a meeting in Mexico on disaster communication, and in the middle of a session on volcano awareness, I texted one of the scientists. I Twitter messaged him back when Twitter was useful, and he basically said, he doesn't engage with the what do you do with it part.
Oh,
And he has become much more engaged. He was very active on social media, and finally kind of crossed that barrier. But he didn't. I think in a lot of these disciplines, as you say, there is this sort of
right.
sense of just put it out there.
Yeah, and I mean that's the way the academy is set up. Yeah, I mean I'm a former professor myself, and I know that your most departments you're not rewarded for public engagement. They might be proud that you get some media mentions, but as far as tenure and promotion reviews, that weighting is not heavy. There are a
Yeah.
few exceptions, but for the most part, that's not the case. And so there's just, I think that then conditions us to not engage in the exercise of thinking through, and then what with my research, and then what
Right.
happens with this information. And so for us to be successful at a vision where we do actually take the venom out of a lot of this, it's really going to, graduate education itself has to get people to think through, and so what about your work? What might happen with it? Do you even understand the history? I think the other issue is how siloed we are in terms of disciplines. And when we started this, we're talking about how I got into this, and I very much care about learning from different disciplines and their views on these things. But that is not how most education happens at the undergrad level. It's certainly not how it happens when you move through your graduate degrees. We just get more and more siloed. And there's not that learning from one another that I think would give you the perspective and the context to understand what happens to your information. I think that is the benefit, I hope, of having a political scientist, a demographer, and a historian together. And Michael and Jay
Right.
have written together for decades as demographer and historian, and I've loved their work over those decades. And that's what I learned from them. So there might be, here are the numbers, and then the historian is saying, okay, last time we saw these numbers, let me tell you a story about Germany or something like that. And it's
Right.
really, I learned so much from the way that you'd see them having a conversation on the page, especially now I know, having worked with them, what it sounds like when they have these conversations, which are a real privilege to listen to as well.
Yeah. So here's the three main chunks of the book, or sort of the case studies, are looking at the continents essentially. Well, the northern
Some,
continents.
and we can say why. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I assume it's because of the high fertility rates being. You're focusing, I think. Well, tell me why. Tell me why
Yeah,
the
that's
focus in
exactly
these
it. And
areas.
and I think what we wanted to do was, we wish we could look everywhere, because this,
Yeah,
and that is our thesis. This is everywhere. And you can just, like those two visuals you had, maybe it's 1960, maybe it's too many or too few or too much of this one and not enough of the other one. Sub that in, but this is universal. And
right,
so we wanted to talk about the places that have the lowest fertility rates, and often the highest migration. That's Michael and Jay had a book in the 90s that I used to teach out of called The Question of Numbers: High Migration, Low Fertility Societies. And there is something particular about that, adding in East Asia, a place where it has some of the world's lowest fertility rates, or the lowest fertility rates, and watching them grapple with what role migration could or should play in population trends. I think gives us an additional dimension. We would love to see people take this kind of framework that we have and expand it. I mean, India would be a great case study, looking at Latin America and the Caribbean as well. But you run out of pages and
Yeah,
years.
sure. And I know you primarily worked on the Asia part, but maybe you could give a quick thumbnail of what the key insights are from Europe, and then
Sure.
and then we'll get to Asia and the US.
Yeah. I think what we really see through the work on Europe is connections with populism and population change. And not a huge surprise, I think, to anyone who watches the headlines. But what I think is valuable about it is because there's such a strong historical grounding, really looking since 1945 to now, what I walk away from with that section of the book is, oh, this isn't changing anytime soon. So I love long-term trends. And if I'm projecting out, do not expect there to be a change away from populism, because the way that reactions are happening to demographic change, and the fact that it's only going to intensify more, because of course we look at these changes, fertility rates being low for a while, populations continuing to really age, and then political reactions to changes in ethnic composition, age composition, economic strains. All of that gives you the recipe for more populist reactions to population. Too many words like populism and population and demography and democracy, but those four kind of go together.
They do, yeah. And there's the closing chapters or sections of the book get at this idea of getting over they're a message not just to the other academics in the field, but to decision makers. There's not a lot of knobs you can tweak to change these things. And I've seen lots of coverage of this reality that fertility rates, for example, are not really subject to policy very much, despite a lot of efforts.
Yeah, I think that's another thing I took away from us working on this book was policymakers seem to think that they were responsible for diffusing the population bomb. So we think about the 1960s, and we know how, and so the first chapter of each of those three sections goes through a time when population growth was really rapid, fertility rates were higher, and the reactions that decision makers had to that. And you see a slew of policies around education, around contraceptive access, all of these things. And I think that it gave decision makers a false sense of power. And that's not to say those policies didn't make a difference. They did make a difference, but we also have enough detail in the book to show that, well, some of this might have happened anyway. Maybe it sped it up in some cases. Maybe it was state-led in some, but it was actually more to do with economic modernization in others. But it wasn't just that the government waved a magic wand and those trends changed, but I think it felt like it. And now, when they are faced with what they consider a different problem, which is not enough people, they get the dust off the magic wand. They bring this out to wave around and say, okay, and let's make them higher. And what I'm perceiving when I go around and talk to different decision makers in multiple countries is that they come to us and say, why isn't this working? And what's implicit is because it worked before. And so what one of the most valuable things I took away from us writing this was saying, oh, but is that exactly what did it before? And if we can show them that it wasn't only that, then maybe that takes a little bit of the venom out as well. And it says, you temper your expectations and think about the larger things you want to change in society. Is that you're really trying to improve well-being? Well, if so, maybe there are some other ways to do it. And we don't want to disincentivize anybody in a high fertility country from investing in health and, family planning and education, because those investments make a difference. It's just a matter of making sure governments have a more humble approach to what they think they can really do.
It's so funny. I hadn't thought about this until you just said it, but And I've written about that issue of the importance of family planning and a woman's
Yeah.
potential to develop her family in high fertility rate countries, but actually that applies in low fertility rates countries too, right? If a woman can't afford to have a baby, she's not going to have a baby. So kind
Yeah, I
of,
mean, it remains, and I think that's another challenge we have right now too. Is when you have this alarm over low fertility, does that mean that access to those things comes under threat, or is maybe there's just a disinvestment in it, and those we wouldn't want to see that happen either.
yeah. You're also reminding me, one of the early people in the 90s who introduced me to this arena of population development was Jesse Osabel at Rockefeller University. And he said this, he's here, I've got to show this. I turned it into a cartoon. Politicians are mostly pulling on disconnected levers in these arenas like energy policy. And I guess probably
Yeah,
from what you're saying, there's a lot of machines moving and everyone has
yeah,
flashy, actions and announcements, but too often we kind of turn that into the case for that this caused that. The same debate is playing out right now with climate, where
yeah,
there's been a recent argument that you can see that the Paris Agreement resulted in the slowing of emissions, but there's a lot of pushback that the just because there was that signature doesn't mean that it was what's caused the change. Natural
yeah,
gas coming in instead of coal, etc. It's so important, and so that gets back to the reality that what you do is important, and this book is important.
yeah.
Um, so the other, Asia. So here, just like 2 days ago, George Monbiot, who's a very liberal columnist at the Guardian, wrote the facts are stark. Europe must open the door to immigrants or face its own extinction. And in China, of course, there's this whole issue now with demographic decline. So again, you did the Asia part of the book for
Yeah.
sure. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk a little more about Europe, and then we'll go to what's going on in the U.S.
Yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, it's there is something different about the piece on Asia because there isn't the same level of migration. Historically in the US, I would say more recently for Europe in terms of becoming a place of in migration. And even though certainly there's always been mobility, but there's been mobility in Asia as well. But when we're talking, the questions that seem to be the case, so the four countries that we look at are China, Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. And it's more of a moment of questioning. To what degree do we want this to be part of our nation strengthening? And I had in mind approaching the research for those something that I hear all the time. I would do give talks, do podcast interviews, and people say, well, Japan and China and Korea will have to open to immigration because they will be facing these tremendous strains from population aging and depopulation. And it's the have to that I really wanted to inquire about, and maybe as a contrarian at heart, because migration, I think, is much more political than demographic. It is a political decision. And each of these contexts at different points in time negotiates what role they want it to play. There is no have to, because there are consequences to migration. There are consequences to not doing migration. And so which consequences do these groups of decision makers want to have? And I think that is still certainly ongoing. There were some, was reading through some debates in parliament in Japan and seeing, prime ministers not want to use the term immigration and coming up with a different term for it to avoid even though that's clearly what they were talking about. In Korea, people will say, oh, we're really accepting foreign workers. But then when, again, through research of the book, it's like, under what circumstances, from which place, are there ethnic ties? And so there's not just a have to as if it's an open borders, but that's also useful, right? And when you're thinking about what role does migration play in society, understanding that there's a full menu of the types of options that you could have is one thing. But I think there's one other one with Asia, and I would say this is where we get to zoom out with and look at the global level for population change. So I think, as most of the people who would be listening to this know, the planet's still growing. We are at 8 billion people now, but it's 8 billion and counting, but soon to hit a peak. I mean, depending on if I start exercising in 2026 or not, I may see it myself. And so that is slowing down. That means that even though we know there are places in the world where population is growing rapidly, sub-Saharan Africa, fertility rates are still highest. 2 out of every 3 people on the planet live somewhere with below replacement fertility rates, meaning below the level needed to replace the mother and a partner. So
amazing.
We are headed in that direction. So when we say, what role can migration play in supplementing natural population loss, deaths over births? Increasingly, these aging countries are actually competing over the same person. And so if every aging country on the planet said, we will just open the borders, the most extreme open migration policy, and let's say, like 150 countries decide to do this, well, only one of 150 will win for that one person, right? And migration flows, we know this, and as a political scientist, and I talked about this in the 8 Billion and Counting book, they follow patterns. These streams follow patterns like water would. And so it's not going to be a perfectly even distribution of people around the world, exactly where the labor market needs were. They'll concentrate in some places than others. And so I would actually argue that many Asian countries are limited in the degree to which they could use immigration to supplement population in the first place, because people are competing over a scarce group. 96% of the world's population still lives in the country in which they were born. My international migration is rare. And so we get a little bit of a check as well. If you kind of put those 2 books together, one says, you don't necessarily count on it. The other says, and this is what it looks like when you do.
Wow. That's a profoundly important aspect of this too. And I noticed just now some headlines. Japan is saying it's still anti-immigration activism as well. I guess the distance between discourse and reality seems really vast.
Yeah.
There's a Joe Shamy, who's a demographer I've known forever, since when he was at the UN, has a new blog. He's got a new piece out and he's on Substack now, with some of that sobering reality you described about 2 out of 3 births are in countries with slowing fertility, with way below replacement.
2 or 3 people. Yep.
Yeah. I noticed back when I was looking at the what PRB works on, that you have there was a post or a project on low fertility.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit more about the sort of what needs work, whether it's work clarifying the difference between data and policy, or work in fundamental questions.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, one of the things I want people to find is a resource that's new on PRB's website, which is that we prepared it exactly, I guess, actually, as authors of this book, we'd be really glad that this resource exists. Originally, we did it as a media tip sheet, because my first year as CEO, I took over 70 either speaking engagements or interviews on low fertility. I mean, it was just so, and those are just the ones I said yes to.
Wow.
It was just so loud around it. And it was the same conversation usually. The first 30 minutes were off the record. Can I actually just please explain something to the journalist? Do you mind explaining the difference between a fertility rate and a birth rate, for example? And then the second half would be a lot of really similar questions. And there seemed to be a real need for education around what you can actually, what's right. And so I think on our low fertility, I'll have to find you a good link for that one too. So it's something like we also just won an Anthem Award for our data health there. It might be down a little lower, but this sheet now has ended up blowing up more into not just a media tip sheet, but a resource that even, anybody who's new to this, I think beyond the headlines, that's it. Yeah,
Right.
what's really happening. So it's a guide to all
Oh,
of
there.
that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and that's part of what I've always loved about PRB is an organization that says, you can come to us and we'll tell you what we know and what we don't. And actually, as you go through the guide, you'll see what we don't know. And then it points to peer-reviewed research gaps. And actually, at the end, we have a resource that we're hoping journalists will take up as well that says, besides just repeating, fertility rates are falling. Oh no. What are other questions you could ask about this? And this is a living document for us. So we're going to keep
That's
going
great.
in there and saying, it'd be so cool if someone wrote an article about this understudied aspect of this. But there's so much more that the media can do. Now that we are seeing a lot of headlines that sound exactly the same about
Right.
fertility rates have fallen. Yes, we know they are down. And we know that probably we're not going to raise them through tax incentives. So what else can we cover about that? And so that's how PRB engages with this. So we look across the life course and have for a long time. So we're a 96-year-old nonprofit. And that means that, we've seen what came into a world that was growing exponentially last century, but had already really started to look at population aging, individual aging and health as well. And then now we know that that's where the world is and is heading. And so we kind of cover that full spectrum. We have a piece I saw came up on your screen as well, written by Apoorva Jadhav, one of our global fellows, that's on infertility. And
Right.
and that's another area where we work. But we hit a lot of the so what. So what is happening? And then why does this actually matter? And so for us, low fertility connects to caregiving. It connects
Right.
to, what's how families get support, how children get support, and it even connects to the workforce. And so we have a future of work initiative. So kind of surround that, not just the actual demographic trend, but the so what piece.
Well, I hope people understand the value of going to prb.org to
Thank you. Yeah.
to get at these questions, to get beyond the cartoons. Speaking of which, let's come to the United States, which has felt like some kind of nightmarish cartoon this past year as the anti-immigrant campaign has coalesced into actual horror shows of many kinds. But, again, as history shows, this is not new either.
Yeah.
1903, Italian immigrants were pictured as rats in this political
Yeah.
cartoon.
Yeah.
And they were all the mafia, and here they come. And boy, does that resonate with. Here was Donald Trump. That was in 2024. Illegal migration is poisoning the blood of our nation. A very old terminology there, and that
Right.
also resonates with that other tweet from Elon Musk earlier about New Zealand. So the U.S., I don't know if you can characterize in your own. Well, there's a whole section in the book on it, but also, where are we and what are the possibilities here? Joe Shamy, actually, way back on my .earth blog at the New York Times, I did a piece. I think the headline was, "What's the right number of Americans?" And it was way more than 300 million. And Maddie Iglesias wrote a book called "A Billion Americans."
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you think about what does this country need to really grapple with, setting aside maybe the superstorm that's happening right now?
Yeah, I think where we are is at a different point in the battle between ideologies. And so that's part of the subtitle of our book is Ideology and the Politics of Population. And what we do when we look at Europe, the US, and Asia is we look at the influences of various ideologies or just, worldviews over time in these different contexts. Ideologies about the family is one. So who comprises a family? Who should
Right.
that be? Views on that are going to shape legal approaches to marriage, right? They're going to shape even how the tax system is developed and policies around that. Ideologies around national identity are another big one. So who belongs? And then ideologies of economic modernization is a big third one. How do you get an economy to grow? And so when I look at what you have on the screen and I think about where we are in the US, I think what we're seeing is a shift in which of those ideologies is coming to the fore.
Mhm.
So as you show clearly here, there's always been tension around ideologies of national identity in the US. Who belongs? Who should be a citizen? When?
Right.
But for a while, that was tamped down because of a desire really to privilege the ideology of economic growth. And people would turn a blind eye. People in power would turn a blind eye to a system that in some ways was broken. And people just ignored it because they were privileging this economic growth. This seems to be a different moment around that, where no longer does that ideology prevail, but it is more about the national identity piece. Or maybe, I mean, I even sit with some questions like, there's one thing, discourse is a huge theme in this book, and we do a lot of tracing of discourse. Politicians will say one thing and then do another, and there are many migration scholars who've talked about that over the years as well. You talk loud and do nothing. And this case is not necessarily the do nothing part, but there are some decision makers, the president aside, who they're playing into the discourse, but they wouldn't really want to follow through on those policies. So what will there be to come in the next few years will probably be more choosing of sides. So those who are in power, who have gone along with the discourse around national threats to national identity, some of them may start to get really worried about the economic part of things, and they may change their tune. That'd be something I would predict to see happen. It might not change things overall in the country, but there'll be some schisms around it.
That's so interesting. You're seeing some hints of that even with some of the shifts and Trump policies related to certain sectors of the economy, certain businesses, when there was pressure. I want to circle back to the sort of where do we go from here part of the book, the Anti-Toxicity Project, and what would it feel like to have this start to play out so that the data and the decisions don't have these vast gaps that we have now? How much of it is the responsibility of people producing the data? Where does the media play? And what does the average person have to do to think or need? What is the opportunity facing the average person when they see they're buffeted by signals?
I love the way you phrase that, because I do think it is an opportunity. We will learn so much more if we do start to take the venom out of this. So, one thing about the data, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that it's getting harder to get the data that we need. Federal data is it's in some cases disappearing. We don't have reliable access to it. Collection of it has always been political. Again, things that we show in the book, and Michael does very well in the part that he focused on in the U.S. It's always been political, but it just gets harder to get that information. So if we are saying, please have data-driven decisions, but you're missing the data, that whole enterprise is difficult. And, we saw as well the demographic and health surveys, which is a way that we learn about what's happening in other countries. How do we know that 2 out of 3 people on the planet live somewhere with below replacement fertility rates? A lot of it is through these kinds of surveys. So those funding for that disappeared when the sunset of USAID. And so will we even be able to get the information that we need is a question. And I wonder, the line is often, well, if the public sector isn't providing something, then the private sector will. So then would that be the private sector providing those data? Some of it could be good on jobs, but some of it maybe we don't necessarily want. How will we know? We really have to start from that. So what can we do? All of us can be advocates for good public data so that people can make decisions. I mean, full stop. We can be advocates for reliable and accessible and dare I say democratized public data. Do people have access to the information they need so that they can make these good decisions? I think the media does have a role to play as well. And a lot of the journalists I speak to, they're newly discovering issues around fertility shift. And so they kind of have to go through did you know this thing was happening themselves before they can get to that next layer of questions. But I really hope that very soon we are going to get to a point where journalists are doing less of the "did you know this is happening" and more of the "okay, what does this mean for caregiving? What does this mean
Right.
for labor force participation? What does this mean for structuring the economy or housing?" I see a little peek of it with housing. Like, you can kind of watch the headlines, but we're still at the really front end of that. Think about, maybe 1950s, early 60s coverage of population versus late 60s and into the 70s. And it was like, so what does this mean for the economy, for conflict, for, yeah, even development, like, how does urbanization play into this for the environment? So we kind of need this next
Right.
layer of things to come up. So I'd love to see the media push to not just tell the same old story, but just keep going in there and alarm cells. And that's the hard part around it. Alarm cells.
Yeah.
I always, I convinced my very kind co-authors to let me put the word toxic in this title. I said, I think we have to do it because that's what sells these days, is pointing out the alarm. So you'll open it and we're not alarmist inside. But what we're
Right.
saying is that discussions around this, they turn toxic
Right.
as soon as you introduce them. And why is that? So yeah, can we ever get to a point where alarm doesn't sell? I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know.
Boy, you're reminding me. Oh boy, back in 2009, Rush Limbaugh, after I had appeared at a meeting in DC on population issues, he on his show got some summary of it, and he said to his listeners that perhaps I should commit suicide if I think that people are the worst thing that ever happened to the planet. So talk about toxic. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
it,
toxic. Yeah,
yeah, pretty amazing.
that's toxic.
Well, this has been a great introduction to the book.
Yeah,
Because of
thank you.
my kind of constrained situation here with my back and stuff, we might draw this toward a close.
Yeah.
But I just want to get maybe one last thought from you in terms of who should read this book and 8 billion. Both of them, I think, are invaluable. And what's
Thanks.
the key takeaway? You kind of touched on it here, but maybe one more time.
Yeah.
What do people think what do people have to get over thinking they know about these issues, and what can these books do to fill the gap?
Yeah, I would say Toxic Demography, and then other work by Michael Teitelbaum and Jay Winter that I studied for years and years and got me into this. That's what you go to when you really, when you do understand that the trends have changed, and you need more context. You want to understand it more deeply, and you also want a dose of humility that this isn't really the first time these discussions have happened. So you get
Right.
that next layer. That's when you go to this. So when you're ready to dive into the history, and if you're somebody who loves history, this is definitely the book for you. And in it, we're really trying to explore why it is that every time we try to talk about population in the public sphere, it gets hijacked and becomes so politicized. And we show how universal that is over time. And the degree to which it's prescriptive is for us to say we all have to just try not to do it. How do we try not to do it? Think about, data, evidence, contextualization, and consider how your work is used. 8 Billion and Counting, the book that I had out before this one, is a great entry point. It'd be the one to go to first to say, what is happening with sex, death, and migration worldwide? How has this changed over time? And in that one, it really kind of starts from this point that and I could have divided it many ways, but tried to make it as accessible as possible to a wide group of readers. The last century was about exponential population growth. This one is really about differential population trends. And so understanding how different areas of the world have really different trends in terms of how fast our population is growing, urbanization, migration, et cetera, and how we can use that, how we could train ourselves to understand what it means so we can make better business decisions and decisions in terms of policy, et cetera.
That's great. I mean, I think it's a highly useful book, and I hope people will have a look at both.
Thank you.
Jennifer
Thank you.
Scuba, I've got your
Thanks.
website there down in the corner of the page, and You did a Substack around
I
your book.
know. And then I took this job, Andy, and I haven't
I
been able to do
know.
as much Substack, but you'll see me do more. 2026 goals is I'm going to get out there more.
That's good.
Yeah.
And the content is there now for anyone who wants to
Yeah.
learn more too.
It's there now. I haven't written in a while, but you can see I use mine to learn more about things I'm curious about. And so, yeah, come along with me to learn,
Well,
especially in 26.
that's what my blogging has
Yep.
always been about. It's basically my active learning. And
Yeah.
one last thought that I hadn't mentioned: back in 2007, when I started .earth, my blog at the New York Times, the blog question was 9 billion people plus one planet equals question mark. And in
Yeah.
2007, I did this piece where I basically thought of this world of Jesse Ausubel mentioned is sort of the planet is imploders and exploders, and
Yeah.
lots of tensions. It's like a plumbing system. When you have
Yeah.
pressures between places, you end up with troubling dynamics.
Yeah.
What I
Yeah.
said at that time, what experts depict is more like a dangerous scattering of cluster bombs as the world splits into two types of countries: those with aging, shrinking populations like Japan and much of Europe, those regions like most of Africa still mired in poverty, disease, illiteracy, or government dysfunction. And the decisions made in different places, can really change outcomes on so many factors, whether it's
Yeah.
conflict, climate, and the rest. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for
Yeah.
being here.
Yeah. And you know what? You're reminding me, I have another piece out because it just came in the mail, but it's not online
Yeah,
yet. It is sitting here. And it is actually because when I saw the word bomb there, it's in this coming January Foreign Affairs, and it is a book review essay on a new book. And so and it's on depopulation. And I think actually stays true to some of the themes that I've talked about here as well.
great.
So
Well,
that was
anyone
cool.
could just search for your name out there on the internet and
Yeah. Yeah.
learn a lot more. Thanks again. This is Andy Revkin,
Thank
another
you.
Sustain What webcast with Jennifer Scuba of Population Reference
Shuba,
Bureau.
Shuba. I'm
Shuba,
Shuba, Andy, like
Shuba.
tuba. I mean,
Oh,
who would
like tuba, right? I saw
Shuba
the
like
little
tuba?
Shuba, and we'll have
Thank
to get
you.
you back on here again sometime because this is just
Anytime.
scratching the surface of a really
Yeah.
important issue. So
Thank you.
everybody, take care. You can share this, share whatever link you're watching this on with others afterwards, and send me ideas for future shows through that scrolling bar at the bottom. And take care. Hold on one second.